So we're just going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Williams. And my apologies. Again, it's the end of the semester. Things are all going a little more haywire than we would prefer. But again, please keep yourselves muted during the talk and put your questions in the chat box. And without further ado, Dr. Justin Williams and his talk on Clovis.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for inviting me here today. This is a very welcome break from the mountain of grading that I have to do. I teach at both Roger Williams University and Assumption University. They're about an hour apart. I live in Rhode Island, and I drive between the two when we were actually driving to teach classes. Today, I'm going to talk about some of my dissertation work and a couple of the resulting publications that occurred thereafter. Mostly, I'm just kind of going through what I've learned in trying to measure a ton of Clovis points, talk about a few biases that folks have found with measuring Clovis points, and kind of the trials and tribulations of trying to measure so many projectile points. So today, I'm going to tell you what Clovis is very, very briefly. I assume most folks know what's up with that, why Clovis is so important. I'll go over a historical review of two selected papers, not because they're the best papers on the subject, but because they're two papers that really influenced my thinking. In some ways, I argue against those papers. In some ways, I agree with those papers. We'll talk about definitions of Clovis. It turns out that one of the trickiest things to do when you're trying to get a huge sample of Clovis points is to settle on a definition. And then once you do settle on a definition, it's really hard to get a sample. We'll take a look at the results of my initial research, which is mostly my dissertation work. Then I'll talk about a couple of the potential biases that people face when doing these big pan-regional studies of Clovis, including site type and function, differing raw material, use wear or life history resharpening. Then we'll take a look at the results of some of my later studies, and then I'll make a few very brief suggestions on how this now very popular field of pan-regional Clovis studies can move forward, in my opinion. So first off, what is Clovis? Clovis is a projectile point, of course, that was made during the later portions of the Pleistocene in North America. They're found throughout North America, which is one of the reasons they interest me so much. Initially, they were thought of to be the oldest artifact type in North America, and that led to the Clovis first paradigm. They're definitely the first fluted projectile points in North America, the flute being that flake scar that runs along it that's used for hafting. Typically, they're lanceolate in shape, and they've been associated, especially initially with the initial finds, with megafaunic hills. And what we see there on this screen is a cast of one of the East Wenatchee Clovis cache points. So why are people so interested in Clovis? Originally, the impetus of Clovis research was to learn more about the original habitants of North and to a lesser extent, South America. Pan-regional studies of Clovis sought to find out what routes people may have taken to initially colonize, to initially enter North and South America. However, with the proliferation of pre-Clovis sites, especially recently, now that the Clovis first barrier has for the most part been broken, these goals have changed a little bit. So ultimately, Clovis remains an essential data set in understanding how the earliest peoples lived and initially settled many parts of North America. So these pan-regional studies of Clovis seek to identify and utilize measurements that get at the intended style of the maker. We try to look at variation in the style and accumulated copy error in an effort to find potential origin points for the technology. Additionally, we seek to figure out whether the technology was spread among already existing people as an idea moving from hunter-gatherer group to hunter-gatherer group, or brought to new areas during the first migrations into some of these regions in North America. So ultimately, pan-regional studies such as the ones I do and that are very popular in American antiquity and archaeology right now seek to examine the shape and size, the morphology of Clovis points to understand variability in their style. So the two previous pan-regional studies that I want to talk about today are Morrow and Morrow 1999 and Hamilton and Buchanan 2009. Now, I should note that Hamilton, Buchanan, Collard, and others have done a ton of papers on this subject, and I've picked the one that influenced me the most to talk about, but I would be happy to answer questions on my opinions on their other work. I really respect their work, but I disagree with them in a couple of fundamental ways. So Morrow and Morrow is one of the earliest papers I read on Clovis points, and I remember reading this paper and being so impressed that they were making statements about Clovis points and, for that matter, fishtail points, and they're taking on a North American and South American wide perspective. Essentially, what they look at is how Clovis points have lateral margins that are even, and how fishtail points slowly, through time and space, begin to get a base that's more concave. And what they note, as shown in the graphic on the far right, is that as you move from the northwest and move southeast down into Central America and South America, they become more wasted, such that the halves become less wide. They argue that that transition could have been caused by people moving with these projectile points and slow accumulation of copiers. They weren't using that language at that time, but slow accumulation of errors and maybe a functional change. And I remember just being so impressed with their efforts to try to use this North America, South America wide perspective. Now, there's some problems with their data set. They had way more Clovis points than they had fishtail points. And you can see that huge gap in their data if you look at their data set, which is in the middle in Central South America, where they had no data. But it's hard to get data on projectile points from that region, especially if you're working from North America. So Hamilton, Buchanan, Collard, and others have come out with a ton of papers. And in these papers, they've been taking a evolutionary archaeology perspective. In some of their original data set work, they had a sample size of 232 projectile points. I would consider most of them to be Clovis. I think they considered most of them to be Clovis. Some of the points in the Northeast are certainly debatable. They sampled from 3 different site types, and I'm going to come back to that because I sampled from the same types of sites. Cache sites, which are either ammo dumps or ritual piles of projectile points that we find very commonly out west. Kill sites, where something was killed, or campsites, which are actually pretty rare for Clovis peoples. Now, if you look at their sample, which is what I show here, and I'll talk about this in the next slide too, they had a very important requirement, and that very much structures their sample. They required that any site they used had some form of absolute dating, typically radiocarbon dating. And what that means is they don't have a sample in the upper Midwest or in California or in the Southeast, right? Many scholars who study Clovis have noted that there may be, and probably are, more Clovis points east of the Mississippi than there are west of the Mississippi. But unfortunately, a lot of the radiocarbon dated sites associated with Clovis are found west of the Mississippi. So we have most of the radiocarbon dated sites in the Great Plains, but a lot more projectile points, Clovis points, in the eastern half of the United States. So it's a bit of a problem. So their requirement that the site have radiocarbon dating or absolute dating in some form means that they're leaving out the Southeast and Midwest. They utilize the accumulated copy error model. This was built on originally the Weber fraction, some work that Weber did a long time ago, but then was redone by Erkens. And what Erkens argued is that due to the limits of human perception, if I try to copy a projectile point that you made, I will probably only come within 5% of perfect. And in actuality, that's probably a much higher number. It's actually really hard to flint knap a projectile point that's exactly the same size as the one you used before because of the reductive nature of flint knapping. But they use this idea that if the technology moved via new people, or if the idea was simply moving, that due to accumulated copy errors, people screwing up and copying the design, the projectile point should change in a predictable way. They used this to test 3 different methods of early peopling to the New World. They included the ice-free corridor, coastal migrations, and the Solutrean model. However, the lack of southeastern and northern Midwestern sample greatly affects this study, right? And to make matters worse, they argued that projectile points through time should get progressively smaller. I'd have to go into great details as to why that model argued that. I've actually, with the help of some other people, even redone that mathematical model before, and that's the only way it comes out, that everything always gets smaller through time, and it's an issue with the math, really. But at the time, I was really impressed with, and still am, their ambition in doing this. And I think their results, they end up arguing that the Northwest coast or ice-free corridor models are the most plausible. But with those 3 cache sites in the Northwest, the 1, 2, and 3 on the previous slide, I'll actually even go back, are all cache sites and therefore have the largest points. So that greatly structured their results in that they're arguing that points should get smaller as this idea moved, as these errors are accumulated, and they have these 3 cache sites in the Northwest anchoring their analysis. So now moving past those 2 studies that I will refer back to occasionally, historically, Clovis has been a really tricky point to define, meaning that it's hard to determine, to get several archaeologists to agree on what a Clovis point is, or what point is Clovis and what point is not. To make matters worse, getting access to samples can be very, very difficult. Believe me, I know this. At one point, I'm pretty sure I'd emailed over 150 different museums, 2 or 3 in each state, in an effort just asking the simple question, how many Clovis points do you have? Do you have good images of them? Or if you have a ton, can I fly out there and make those images? So, to make matters worse, a lot of museums are really underfunded. And one of the emails I classically got back when I sent that email when I was seeking my sample was, yeah, we have a lot of projectile points. We're pretty sure many of them are Paleo-Indian. Do you want to come out and see which ones are which? And at that time, as a grad student, I didn't have that kind of funding. So I had to stick to the museums who said, yes, we had Clovis points. Yes, we have images of them. Yes, we can send them to you. Or please come out. We've got 30, come scan them, which is what I did. So my solution to try to get as many projectile points as possible was to analyze images of Clovis points. I'm happy to answer questions about that. At the time, I was using a piece of software called Canvas to make linear measurements. At this point, I've moved on to ImageJ because ImageJ is free and it's just frankly easier to use. So if you look at, I've modified this from a previous study, but if you look at some of the most popular definitions of Clovis, you can start to see major issues of disagreement, right? One of the things we all agree on, however, is that pretty much all researchers agree Clovis should have a concave base, right? One of the things researchers don't agree on is how many sides of the projectile point have to be fluted. Some require that both sides be fluted, and some require that, okay, maybe just one be fluted. And that varies depending on who you talk to. One of the other major points of contention is how long that flute is allowed to be. We find that many other post-Clovis Paleo-Indian point types have much longer flutes, Redstone in the southeast, Folsom, and many more, right? So how long will we allow that flute to be? Some researchers allow it to be up to 2/3 of the total length of the point, while some researchers only allow it to be half the total length of the point. Some researchers have requirements that it be at least 1/3 of the total length of the point, but I've certainly seen points I would call Clovis that had tiny little flutes. So that's another major point of contention. I remember when I started this project and I was talking about it at the SAAs, an archaeologist came up to me and said, I'm really interested in your project, but what I have to know is how you define Clovis. And I went through all these different things and I talked about a lot of the definitions found here. And what he finally said was, look, you just got to pick a definition and defend it because everybody has their own version of this definition. And that's advice I've always followed ever since. So analysts are left with 2 real options, in my opinion, when trying to build a pan-regional sample of Clovis points. You can select a very narrow definition of Clovis, like Hamilton, Buchanan, and Collard tend to do, and that ends up with a sample that often leaves out the very important, in my opinion, southeastern United States, and also leaves out the northern Midwest and California, right? Because we don't have radiocarbon dated sites everywhere. And that kind of moves on a continuum along to option 2, this isn't a dichotomy, in which you take a less conservative approach and build a sample that includes all of these regions, but relies on a morphological definition. And then you have to defend that definition over and over and over again, because people are going to go, well, I can't believe you included this, but didn't include this. And then you have to say, well, I included that because my definition works like this. So not having this very narrow, well-accepted definition of a Clovis means that researchers are stuck either using things that we all agree are Clovis and leaving portions out, or making up their own definition as I did and just constantly defending why you did what you did. So personally, I use a definition that requires a concave base. It has to be fluted on at least one side. And the flute ideally is less than half the total length, but I allow the flute to be more of the total length. And this is admittedly very subjective if the projectile point seems to have gone through significant retouch and reworking or resharpening, as the example is from Dietz up in the top right. So if I see major evidence of resharpening and retouch, then I will allow the flute to be longer. So in my initial studies, I built a sample of 694 Clovis points. And if you actually go through and do the math, it adds up to 695. I recently figured out that I had a duplicate in my data set. It doesn't affect any of the stats or anything like that. And despite my best efforts, my goal was just to get as many Clovis points as I could. And I ended up with a pretty biased sample myself, in that most of my points are from east of the Mississippi, something about 530 or so. Whereas I only have 85 from the Great Plains. Despite my best efforts, only 5 from California, only 6 from the inland Northwest, which is where I was when I was writing my dissertation, and then 23 from the Southwest. I did divide these into a version of Kroeber's classically defined culture areas because people were doing that at the time, and I want to see if these proxies, even though they're kind of bad proxies for a Pleistocene environment, if the points from these different regions were morphologically different. So the goals of my initial study were to evaluate the usefulness of various traditional linear measurements. I was not using geomorphometrics at that point. I had intended to in my dissertation, but when we all sit down to write our dissertations, we have these giant ambitions. And I quickly realized that I needed to stick to traditional linear measurements if I wanted to get done. So that's what I did. I tried to identify possible biases to interpreting Clovis hafted bifaces or projectile points in the creator's style. So things like raw material variability, things like site function, things like resharpening and retouch. How much does this affect our goal of getting at style? And then I sought to evaluate regional differences in size and shape of Clovis. So I took a variety of measurements. Some would say perhaps too many, but I wanted to take as many linear measurements as I could to try to sort out which ones really worked to get at style and which ones didn't. Mostly I took maximum length and width, then a variety of length and width measurements. A really important and often admittedly subjective portion of my analysis is to decide on where the haft blade division is. So a portion of that projectile point, the upper portion, the way this point is oriented, is the blade, and the portion below is the haft. Typically, this is done through edge grinding and things like that. I've also found that many, certainly not all, but many Clovis points, that half blade division is the widest point, but that's not always true. And I will admit to anybody who asks that this is the most subjective part of my analysis. I do feel that I can confidently do it on an image. And I've actually compared these estimations with people who have done it on real projectile points. And I'm pretty happy with how close I get to their estimates as well, because you have to build in the differences between the analysts and also the difference between the fact that I'm doing it with an image and they're doing it with a real projectile point. So what I did after taking all these measurements on 694 Clovis points, this graph shows, I think, a lot of my study in one helpful figure. What this is, on the y-axis is the frequency, and along the x-axis is z-scores. So essentially what this builds is the more similar these lines indicating each different measurement that I did, the more similar, the more oriented or correlated these measurements are. Right? And what you can see is they're pretty similar. Right? It's a very messy graph, but it gets the point across that all of these things seem to be pointing to the same aspect of the point, right? And what I've come down to is that most of these traditional linear measurements, with a few exceptions, are really related to the size of the projectile point, not the shape, right? And if we want to get at the intended style of the person who made them, really shape is more important. So a lot of these things just correlate with the size of projectile point, which is problematic. So in addition to that, I took some of the most useful measurements, including max length, base depth, flute length on both the long and short side if both sides were available, and then I ran a Spearman's row between them. What sticks out to me in this table is that most of the length measurements, max blade length and max length, are highly correlated. The one that stands out and the measurement that I like the most, that I think gets that style the best in my study, however, is base depth. And I think there are a lot of good reasons for that. Base depth requires multiple flake removals. We do have evidence, especially at sites like Dietz in Oregon, where Clovis points snapped at about half the total length of the haft, and they basically rebased the blade end in an effort to remake the point. And also, base depth has to do with the junction between the projectile point and the thing they were hafting it to, right? So they have to adhere the rules of whatever shaft they're attaching these projectile points to when they make that base depth. And it's several flake removals, and it's something that can be redone if the point breaks. So one of my favorite traditional linear measurements, or the one that I think gets its style best, is base depth because of the process through which base depth is created. If you look at regional variability in terms of Clovis, in this case, maximum length, you can see that my sample really structures this. Unfortunately, the fact that I have very few points in the Great Basin really means that that histogram doesn't look quite the same. But honestly, they're very, very similar, that you do get a great variety of sizes of projectile points in each of these regions. And the thing that really structures that isn't actually variability in the point size, but it has to do with the frequency of cache versus kill versus campsites, which is what we'll talk about later. So the size of the projectile points doesn't really work out, especially when you take the variability of site type out. So if you look at regional variability in Clovis and hone in on my favorite measurement, which is base depth, you do see a slight bit of difference in base depth between the Northeast and everywhere else, right? And this is indicated to me that the northeastern Clovis points, or at least the northeastern fluted points, are different. There are some archaeologists who in fact argue that nothing in the northeast region is in fact Clovis, that that's a later point type called Gainey, and that as you move northeast into New England and up into Maine, they have more site-specific point types, and that in fact Clovis people or people bearing Clovis points never existed there, and those are actually later Paleo points. I don't want to make that typological call, but what I can say based on this and other analysis is that the base depth, which is my favorite measurement in capturing style, is very different in the Northeast. They tend to have deeper bases, and that's something I tend to associate it with later period Paleo points, not Clovis. So in doing this study, I came across 3 sources of variation in pan-regional studies of Clovis. You can kind of consider these roadblocks in an effort to get at morphology being style. Right? That these are things that can affect size and shape of Clovis points that have nothing to do with the intended product of the maker or limitations on what the intended product could be. The first one is raw material types. It's often said that all Clovis are made of chert, or at least CCS. And for the most part, that is true. A lot of Clovis points are made of chert, but there are certainly things that I found in my efforts to build up a sample that I would call Clovis that were made on something else. So we'll take a brief look at that. Site function and use is also very, very important. Cache points tend to be larger because they haven't been resharpened. Some people argue that cache points tend to be larger because they were intended and made larger in an effort for ritual use. Kill sites tend to have projectile points running kind of the continuum in use where retouch, which reduces the size of the point because they could have been lost on the first time they used it, and they could have been lost on the 100th time they used it, having been resharpened several times. Campsites overall, as rare as they are, tend to have very strange Clovis points. The one that always comes to mind in my mind is Galt, which has some very odd looking Clovis points. And we can talk about why that is, but camp points tend to be smaller. These are points that were discarded, points that weren't found to be good and tossed away initially, or points that had simply been used down to the nubbins and were just done with, right? So they tend to be typically smaller. And of course, the thing that I think people who are doing pan-regional studies of Clovis need to pay more attention to is life history. Using this metaphorically from biology, essentially life history is the study of how the bodies of organisms change throughout time, but the same applies to Clovis and to lithic tools in general. I always like to think of lithic stone tools not as a product, but as a process. And at some point in that tool's use, that product fell out, right? It could have been used and resharpened 100 times. It could have been used and resharpened only once, or it could have been freshly made. And that has effects because lithics are a reductive technology like sculpture or wood carving. Once you take a piece off to resharpen a thing, you can't put it back, that you've changed the size and shape of that. And sometimes, if you're not a very good flint knapper like myself, in relatively unpredictable ways, right? So you have to account for the fact that the life history, the resharpening, reuse, breakage affects the stylistic signal in these projectile points. So as I mentioned previously, most projectile points, Clovis points are made of chert. And that's definitely true in my sample as well. I have 565 Clovis points that were made of chert. I found 8 Clovis points that were made of crystal quartz, 3 Clovis points that were made of fossiliferous chert, 5 that were made of obsidian, and 14 that were made of what I call quartzite. They tend to call it something else in the upper Midwest. And you can see that that does have, this is a box plot of max length, that does have a slight effect on the size of these projectile points. Quartzite points tend to be larger overall, and that probably has something to do with the raw material package size that they're using, the rocks, the size and shape of the rocks that they're using to make these projectile points. And so that is a variable we have to take into account. You could, of course, say that you're going to build your sample only of chert Clovis bifaces, but you have to acknowledge that you are leaving a few things out that other people would, in fact, call Clovis. Site type and function has a huge effect on the morphology of Clovis points. Like Buchanan et al., including Collard and Hamilton, I separated those sites out into camp, cache, and kill. Now, in this version of it, and I've done it both ways, I included any point of unknown origin, i.e. it was found on a survey or something like that, in the kill category. I've also included them in an undetermined category by themselves, and it really doesn't have a great effect on the analysis. But running crustical wall tests between the site types for 6 measurements, which include flute width, max length, max width, base depth, flute length long, and short, you find that it is really significant. These site types are different, right? Max length, definitely, with cache points largely driving that analysis. They tend to be much, much larger, typically, but not always, than other projectile points. And also that's true for max width. Base depth is different at the 0.1 level, right? But there's a little bit, it's not as different, right? The base depth isn't as variable between site types as the other measurements, but everything else is highly variable. So you have to take into account site type when you're doing these pan-regional studies. What I tend to do is run my study or analysis with the cache points and without the cache points, and then with the camp points and without the camp points, because they're kind of on the two ends of the spectrum, whereas the kill or undetermined points tend to be in the middle in terms of size and shape. But you really have to take into account the cache points because for the most part, I'm not saying this for all cache sites, but for the most part, they are significantly different, at least the ones in the Northwest. So life history, use wear, and resharpening is probably the most tricky aspect, and it's the one that I struggle with the most. Some researchers in pan-regional studies of Clovis have just kind of written it off. They said it's not a problem. Changing the size of the point shouldn't adjust the shape, things like that. But I have found that that's definitely a problem. I was very surprised though. So what I did initially is I took all my haft measurements and I took all my blade measurements and I calculated the coefficient of variation, i.e. how variable these things are. I expected to find that haft variance or measurements wouldn't be as variable as blade measurements. The idea being that they resharpened the blade while it was hafted, right? Fixing small issues, resharpening, things like that. So the blade element should be affected more. And it is, right? The COV values are a bit higher, but not a ton higher. And honestly, Hamilton, Buchanan, and Collard found the same thing in their sample. They interpret that in various places, and they've interpreted it differently. But originally, they interpreted it to mean that Clovis points weren't resharpened, or they weren't resharpened very often. And I find that very hard to believe. I've seen points at Dietz that have definitely been resharpened. I've seen points that have been broken and redone. So I interpret that very differently. I interpret that to mean that, yes, they were retouching, resharpening the blade, and occasionally, and maybe even often, they were retouching and resharpening the haft, right? So they're retooling the whole thing. And that's very different interpretations with effectively the same data. And if I'm right, that means life history, use wear, and resharpening is a huge problem if we're trying to get to style. And honestly, it's not a problem I've solved, and it's something we're going to have to continue to work at. So one of the ways I've taken to address that, along with Mason Niquette, was to look beyond Clovis and include Gainey points and Dalton points and look to see if there's any foreseeable differences in how the tolerance and how they resharpened and the life history of these projectile points. So we used a sample of Gainey, Dalton, and Clovis points from all of the states shaded in gray. Any of the triangles are Dalton sites, circles are Clovis sites, dots are Gainey sites, and we also included random points that were found in various places, and that would be indicated by a state being in gray. That means we didn't have a specific site that we drew points for, but we did have images of projectile points that we used. Essentially, what we were really interested in is the HBW, or half blade width. So effectively, we made an index that takes the blade half division length, which is typically found at the middle of the point, the line that divides the blade from the haft. We subtracted that from a measurement that was a width measurement that was taken from the half blade width portion. And essentially what this does is it measures the degree to which the blade element of the point can narrow in comparison to the haft element. In doing that and creating this index, what we found is that Clovis tends to have a very low HBW, meaning that the blade typically is almost as wide as the haft, right? Gainey slightly higher, and Dalton actually has quite a bit higher index and more of a range. What this means is that Dalton points, or the makers of Dalton points, allowed the blade to get skinnier and skinnier and skinnier due to resharpening. Clovis makers didn't really. They would retouch probably the haft in an effort to prevent that, and Gainey, people who made Gainey points were somewhere in the middle. Essentially, these two projectile points that I have here show off what I think of as the difference between Clovis resharpening and Dalton resharpening. The point in the middle is a Clovis point from Dietz, and you can see that it took on this very triangular shape as it got shorter and shorter and shorter and resharpened and resharpened and resharpened. The point on the left is a Dalton point, and you can see that that blade has narrowed much more than the Clovis point, and that was okay. And I think that's because Clovis points were used in a different way from Dalton. My personal preference or personal reason for thinking that is that Clovis points were used to take on very large animals, and they had to be that lancelet shape in an effort to penetrate the animal as quickly or as deeply as possible in an effort to kill it. Whereas Dalton points were used for a variety of different things, and the blade could be narrowed such that it took on that shouldered appearance. That shouldered appearance would stop the Dalton point from penetrating the animal as deeply. There could have been a lot of other explanations for this, but the trend is there that you do see this decrease or increase in HBW as you go through time from Clovis to Gainey to Dalton. So, suggestions for pan-regional studies moving forward. I feel that researchers should consider samples including paleo projectile points beyond just Clovis, as we did in our 2019 study. I think that because our Clovis definitions are shaky at best, that recognizing that all paleo Indian projectile points are really on a continuum and change gradually through time, and including as many different types within our studies as we can, will allow us to see how style changed through a greater range of time, right? So we should start including points beyond Clovis, middle paleo Indian, and later paleo Indian points. I think researchers really need to do work to understand and mitigate the three biases discussed here. Some researchers have said, oh, it's not a problem. They put out a data set or a study that says retouch isn't a problem, raw material variability isn't a problem, site type isn't a problem. But I think that's still something we have to address every time we do one of these pan-regional studies. And I think analysts need to carefully consider how and if their sample fits with the questions they want to ask. If you are asking a question that requires points that have to be Clovis, right, then you probably do want to do what Hamilton, Buchanan, and Collard tend to do and say, look, it has to have radiocarbon dates. Everybody has to agree this is Clovis, because that's one type of question. But if you're asking questions that can include points that may or may not be Clovis, then you want to make sure that you don't have those biases, especially regional biases, because those very tight, very restricted Clovis samples often end up leaving out the Southeast or Midwest, and those regions may be really important to understanding Clovis style. Many thanks to my dissertation committee, William Andrewski Jr., Colin Greer, Luke Primo, and David Anderson. Thanks to my co-author, Mason Niquette, and of course, all of you for allowing me to come and speak. If you have any questions, I'll certainly field them now, or you can contact me later at justinpatrickwilliams@gmail.com.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. That was really fascinating. I'm like nerdily excited about this topic.
Thanks.
So super neat. So we have a couple questions, and then I have a couple of my own, because now you've really got my brain pinging about things. So first up, so if there's such considerable variation in Clovis points while still observing shared diagnostic characteristics or features, is it unreasonable to think that Clovis, as we currently understand it, represents more than one lithic industry types, like Clovis type 1, Clovis type 2, etc.?
Yeah, I definitely think so, right? And our inability to agree on a Clovis definition and taking everything as I did in my dissertation and just saying, hey, all these things are Clovis, I'm going to see what happens. There may be more types within them. So that becomes a debate of, do these types really exist, which is something archaeologists argued in the 50s, right? Or are we placing these types, are we manufacturing these types and carving up the past? And I think that's why it's so important, or at least I'm going to, moving forward, take in all paleo points in an effort to kind of avoid that issue. If I just say I'm going to take everything that's fluted and also Dalton, or everything that's fluted and everything that comes immediately after it, then what Clovis is and what it isn't, the types are these type definitions good, or should we divide Clovis into things like Gainey, Western Clovis, Great Basin Clovis, things like that, as people have suggested, or the different types as were suggested in the question, isn't so much an issue. But to test that, we need to get, I think the problem, or the reason we haven't come to more statements about that, is because we tend to use those really restricted data sets that might not include your Gainey points or your Clovis type 2 or Clovis type 3. So if you're only looking at the classic Clovis points that are radiocarbon dated, you're not going to see those other types, or you might only have one or two in your sample and they might just show up as being variants. So I think it definitely is time to start looking at, is the Clovis type real? Are we making this up? And the way I would do that is to include more Paleo Indian points beyond just Clovis. And the other way to do that would be to relax your definition of Clovis and start including those things that might be the Clovis type 2 or type 3 or Gainey or whatever you want to call those different points.
Cool. So that sort of flows into the next question, which is whether you think the variation you're measuring is cultural or functional or neither.
Right. So that always makes me think of, because I originally conceived of this project as an evolutionary archaeology endeavor. And that makes me think of Dunnell, style versus function. I always think of those as a continuum, right? That is a projectile point. A Clovis point could be stylistic and functional. And so I think we're getting both those things wrapped together. If some of the researchers who argue that cache points are ritualistic, then those are stylistic and they were never meant to be used. And so I'm tossing these points. Let's assume for a second those people are right. I'm tossing those points that are purely stylistic and never meant to be used in with my projectile points at deets that are just turned down to nothing, right? That were obviously used a lot of times, right? And resharpened and resharpened and resharpened. So I guess, yes, we're finding both those things. And I think addressing those biases like raw material size, resharpening would definitely go in the function category. The more we try to find ways to narrow out those biases, get rid of that variability, the more we're getting at the style that we really want to get at, right?
Yeah, really, it's so super interesting. So if we're going to into the next chat question, so that ties in a little bit, thinking about whether there's sort of cultural types or functional types, and if they are something like functional types, and that might explain why we see fewer of them in the Northeast, for example, where I mean, your big game is things the size of deer as opposed to things the size of like mammoth. But then that doesn't necessarily explain why we don't see why the numbers for the Midwest in particular are really, really low. And I'm wondering if you could speak on what you think that might be due to, whether it's something that is specific to an artifact of the past, or if it's something in terms of like sampling bias.
Yeah, I think it's sampling bias. In that, like, there were a couple sites. There was a site. The name to me is not coming to me right now. There was a site in Wisconsin that I went to go get. It's in the museum in Madison, and they were like, it's been collected over different years. It's been in farm fields, right? And we think these are Clovis. We think some of these may have been planted, like somebody flint knapped these and put them in there. And so I ended up leaving that site, parts of it out of my site of my analysis. So I think one of the big deals is that in the eastern woodlands, a lot of those Clovis points, and that's also true in the Midwest, definitely true in the Southeast, it's not, it's our sample doesn't match the reality of Clovis people, right? That there were probably a ton of Clovis people in the Southeast and maybe some Clovis people in the Midwest as well. But a lot of those Clovis points that represent those people are in the hands of collectors. Clovis is a aesthetically very pleasing artifact. That's one of the reasons I wanted to study it initially. And unfortunately, that means that it's in the hands of collectors. And there's been some really good work comparing like how much tilled land there is and how much Clovis has been found, and then estimates about how much Clovis is in the hands of collectors. I briefly, for a second, when I have worked with some collectors, but I definitely evaluate the ethics of what they're doing. But for a brief time, I was at a Facebook group just to see what people had, and they had Clovis, they had caches, right, that are unknown to archaeologists. So I think asking somebody to, I think asking how well the sample I've created or the sample other people have created or the radiocarbon sample Clovis that we've created jointly as archaeologists matches reality might be impossible to answer because the collecting issue, the tilling issue. I mean, there's a reason that the initial Clovis we found were in the were kill sites in these big megafauna, because anybody walking in the desert or the plains or wherever saw those remains and went, that's weird. And then they found projectile points in it. And that doesn't take a trained archaeologist to do that. So that's why I think we have the radiocarbon stuff out west, because when you do find it, it's very obviously Clovis. Whereas out east, we have all these till fields, all these collectors, all these sites that have been destroyed, things like that. So how well that sample matches reality, we may never know. It may be too late. I know that's kind of a non-answer, but I think with this so much that happening in the eastern woodlands, it may be unknowable at this point.
Yeah, interesting. This is something, especially in terms of thinking about quantity of or area of tilled land and landscape position of soils that are actually old enough to contain Clovis and other Paleoindian artifacts. Now I'm going to stop thinking about it, else it'll add a chapter to my dissertation.
There's a really weird function of my analysis. Sorry to cut you off, but I was just reminded this, that I was requiring county level provenience, right? Because that's what collectors tend to do. And so a lot of these, like a lot of my projectile points were from collections donated to the Gilcrease Museum, and they were all labeled by county. So I thought, if I want more projectile points, I need counties. But if you think about county size east of the Mississippi, there are 120 counties in my home state of Kentucky. There are like 20 something counties in Washington state, and they're about the same size, right? So not only that, but I'm by using county level provenience, which is commonly used, I'm greatly changing the unit of analysis. If you go back to my initial sample map, you look at the county sizes, right? They're much smaller in the eastern side of the country than they are in the western side of the country.
Fascinating. As I said, I genuinely have stopped thinking about it. Also, I'm going to add, it will add a chapter to my dissertation, and that's not an option at this point.
Yeah, don't do that.
It's not worth it. So the next question is, do you have any association with bone types found near lithics, which is one of the original identification settings for these artifacts?
Do you mean like the species of the animal associated with the lithics?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. I have never tried that, to be honest. There are things I would love to do. I do have access to the like bone rods associated with Anzic, and things like that, but I am not great at Zoark. So I usually take people's word when they say this was associated with this animal. I haven't run much associations with that, and I think the reason I haven't thought much about that, frankly, is that same east-west bias, that we don't have as many projectile points associated with good fauna remains east of the Mississippi. So that would be introducing a new bias. I haven't personally looked at, if there are associations with mammoth or different other creatures in certain regions, but I'd be concerned about how spotty and ultimately random that sample would end up being. But it's not something I can comment too much on. I know there is, and I've been trying to get access to it, a database of Pleistocene megafauna and where they've been found. And I've always wanted to like take the PIDBA and overlay them, but I can never get quite access to that. I know that's running around in other circles, in biology circles.
Yeah. Ooh, that would actually be really interesting.
Yeah.
It'd be really interesting to look at. So our next question says that they're wondering if you included the purportedly more gracile far western Great Basin fluted points in your dissertation sample. And if so, did you find that they fell within the range of variation for Clovis elsewhere?
The smallest points that I included, because I do include deets in the Great Basin, I did include those. That was major. Of the smallest points in that region, those are the ones I included. I know that Hamilton, Buchanan, and others tend to avoid that site. I know that there have been some larger projectile points found associated with deets in the last few years, but I did include those. And largely, I take care of that variability because I have deets down as a camp. So when I remove deets out as a camp, that tends to remove that variability. And that's what I associate that with. That's why I think of those as being smaller, but it could be an issue of just how large of a projectile point you can make on that kind of obsidian, which is the mahogany obsidian found. I don't know if it's the exact stuff found out of Glass Buttes, but you can see from the sample actually that you can see the sample taken from that. That's a little slit on the deets point, right? So those are the gracile ones that I included were from deets, and I tend to take that variability out with camp and associate that with being a camp. If I compare deets to like Galt, overall the deets points are quite a bit smaller, but the other thing that I have from deets is a lot of these half-halves. It's hard to say that, but essentially it's the bottom half, the basal concavity portion where the points snapped and then they retooled the upper half. And I probably have 4 or 5 of those out of deets. I can only include those in portions of my analysis because they're obviously not complete. So I did include some of the smaller points from the Great Basin, which I would put deets in the Great Basin. Some people might not.
Interesting. Thank you. So that question ties into what is at this point our last question from the chat. Oh, wait, we have more. So we'll go into, so the question is, does the Clovis tradition share any connections with the North American Paleoarctic tradition?
I have seen, the only paper I know of talking about that, and I think it was Heather Smith. It's been relatively recent. I think it was Heather Smith. And she did an amazing study looking at, this kind of relates ice-free corridor projectile points, what there are in doing stylistic analysis. And she shows that it might go backwards up the ice-free corridor, that she's seeing a stylistic signal that goes from inland North America towards Alaska. Some people have argued that Nenana is pretty similar to Clovis in the fact that I think both have overshot flaking, but I'm talking quite a bit outside of my area at this point. I've heard people talk about that at that point, but the paper that I take that I really enjoyed, and I couldn't talk much about it, and I think it was Heather Smith that looked at the projectile points that exist in the ice-free corridor as much as we found them, right? Because not very many people live in that part of Canada. And then kind of track the stylistic trend backwards. And that's been the most compelling work I've seen on that.
Interesting. Thank you. So our next question is, It's about the fake points, and whether or not you think many fake points have entered collections through donations from artifact collectors who purchased them or made them for that matter. And that might be affecting skewing these types of surveys.
Absolutely. And I left that out as a potential bias, but I think that's the danger in my less conservative sample size type is if you're saying, you know, this person donated this museum, it's got kind of level of convenience and you're including it, it could be faked. I know of, despite looking at, you know, over 1,000 of these things now, I certainly don't have a foolproof way to discern if a thing's a fake or not, right? I don't think any archaeologist does, because I mean, what we rely on, of course, is context. And Clovis being robbed often of this context is highly problematic. Some people argue patina, some people argue. The thing that makes me nervous when I see a projectile point that's an unknown context is when it shows very little signs of retouch, resharpening, or breakage. And when I see a projectile point that's been collected by someone who's reportedly got it out of a field and it's pristine and perfect and not broken in any way, it really leaves me wondering about that sample. The way, and I didn't have a chance to talk about that here, what I did in my dissertation, and honestly I want to get back to, is I had a tiered system. So I had a tier 1 that were sites that had radiocarbon dates associated with Clovis. I had a tier 2 that were sites that everybody kind of agreed on were Clovis and all the points there fit the definition. A tier 3 that was projectile points that really well fit my definition, right? And then a tier 4, which were projectile points that could be Clovis and could be not. And at times in my dissertation, I, you know, took out tier 4 and tier 3, did things like that. It didn't have huge effects on my overall analysis, but I think that is a strategy that researchers can use. Is say, you know, I'm 100% certain this is a good Clovis, it's got radiocarbon dates, it meets my definition, and then kind of try their analysis with and without those points that they're less confident in. I think that's a method that people can use to kind of fight that, you know, manufactured Clovis, faked Clovis, collected Clovis that isn't really Clovis because so many lack context.
Interesting. So our next question is whether you poked around with geographic variation in measurements like HBW, and especially so if we're talking about game size varying geographically, the question is about whether HBW measures tracks or correlates with that in some way.
I haven't done it with that specific index because that paper is relatively new. And as I was talking about going in, I teach a lot. But that is kind of my plan. Initially in my dissertation, I had, apparently there are Excel sheets that tell you the distance from one county in the US to every other county in the US. And they're huge to download. And I had written out and played with all of those. So I was looking at, if you imagine like dropping a rock into a pond and the ripple effect. So I was trying different potential Clovis origin points with all my linear dimensions and looking at to see if that distance from that county, testing it and regressing it using regression effectively. It didn't work as well as I thought it did. There was definitely a day, I think there's a typo in my data set where I thought I'd all figured it out. And then I found out there's like a decimal point in the wrong spot or something like that. That was about a year before my dissertation was done. The day I found that out was a bad day. But so that is something I want to do, and that's the kind of data I want to play with. I've actually recently been teaching by necessity GIS courses, and so now that I've kind of learned to use this open source GIS software, that's kind of on my radar is taking indexes like the HBW and looking at different potential origin points for the technology or changes through time and space. The problem is when doing those kinds of things, when you're using Clovis points that don't have good absolute dates, is how do you separate differences in time and space, right? If you're seeing differences through time and you don't have good radiocarbon dates, that may appear very similar to seeing distances across space, and they might be conflated. It might be people moving with the technology. So you're seeing differences in style based on both time and space. So try to figure out how to separate those two with points that don't have absolute dates is very difficult.
Very cool. Yeah, that's all. As I said, I'm almost struggling for words because my brain is trying to go off and think about all of this.
I spent many years doing that whole thing, and I had these huge tables. The Excel sheets would freeze my poor ancient laptop every time I would download them. And I think I had to go through and type in all the data. It was wacky, and it didn't work. I spent a year doing it. But I think making some of these indexes and playing with variables that I think are more sensitive to style, like base depth, are the direction to go.
Yeah, so that was this was really, really fascinating. We don't have any more questions in the chat. If someone has questions that they would still like to ask, you're welcome to unmute and ask Dr. Williams your question. Um, Otherwise, we will start wrapping up and not take up too much of Dr. Williams' time this evening.
I'm done grading for the evening, so I consider.
All right, so I think we are set. Thank you all so much for coming to Explorations in Archaeology. This is our final one of the semester. We will be back in late January of next year, so keep an eye out for that. Again, if you or someone you know is interested in giving an Explorations in Archaeology talk, please email me, Layla Joyce, or Beth Potter. So I'm pointing up because she's above me in the lineup of things. And we will get you scheduled for everything. And Dr. Williams, thank you so much for being with us. It was a fascinating talk. I'm going to be struggling to not think about this until I'm through some other things.
Thank you very much for allowing me to come speak. It was great.